It's logical that we should have selected today as the day to talk about the first airplane flight in Iowa City, because today is the second annual fly-in to Iowa City, and there are many, many people here who have flown in. There are countless planes on the other side of the airport. There's much activity here, a big crowd. There are parachute jumps. So there's a great deal of activity, and it is most logical that we should be here today to talk about the first airplane flight in Iowa City, which was way back October 13th, 1910. So let's go inside on the other side of the building and see some of the planes that are here from all over the state. It seems like it was only yesterday that first flight was in Iowa City. That was a long time ago, though, but the details are still just as clear in my mind as they were at that time. And I suppose that's not surprising, because after all, I was a wide-eyed, excited, eager boy of 10 years of age. I was going to see the first flight in Iowa City, the first airplane flight. And that wasn't just the first flight in Iowa City, that was the first flight in the state of Iowa. We were really recording some history that day. Now that flight was at the site of the old Johnson County Fairgrounds, which was just to the west of where City High is today. And the plane was to take off from the infield. And of course there was a big crowd there, and I'll get into some of the details of what was going on. But anyhow, Captain Thomas Baldwin had his plane on the infield. He called it the Red Devil. I never thought that was a very good name. I thought he should have called it the Lark or the Eagle or the Hawk. But no, he called it the Red Devil. Anyhow, he started off on the infield of this half-mile track, and he went to the east, a little bit to the north. He took off beautifully. He got up to a height of 150 feet. That was considered high. And he made a circle off to the north and the northwest. And then he came back into the field and he landed. And that was a beautiful landing. And he stepped out of the plane, and they said to the plaudits of 10,000 people. Now I suppose the plaudits of 10,000 people means that there were 10,000 people there in the stands in the surrounding area. Well, anyhow, Captain Baldwin stepped out of his plane and he said, "You haven't seen anything yet. There'll be 2 more flights this afternoon." Well, there was another one. That was not as successful, but it was very dramatic, and we'll go into that a little bit later. But I did want to tell you first what the occasion was for this airplane flight. The Iowa City Commercial Club, and it was called Commercial Club then, not Chamber of Commerce. The Iowa City Commercial Club had staged this, they called it a Fall Festival and Aviation Meet. And they had advertised it all over eastern Iowa. And there were big crowds because, as I say, this was not only the first airplane flight in Iowa City, it was the first airplane flight in the state. This was October 13th, 1910. So you can see it was an early year in aviation. And they'd advertised this, and they had arranged special trains to come into Iowa City. Actually, it was a 2-day aviation meet, October 12th and 13th. But the second day was the big day, and the crowd began to gather early in the morning on the second day. The first train in was the Fast Mail from West Liberty, and there was a big crowd of West Liberty people got off. And then there was a special train from Cedar Rapids, and the Cedar Rapids Chamber of Commerce, or Commercial Club they called it, got off of that train. And they also had a Marine band. And then there was a number of other trains come into Iowa City. That's in the days when there were 5 trains either way, in and out of Iowa City on the main line. And then there were trains that came in on the Plug Railroad, which was that small railroad where the station was down where the recreation building is today. And so the crowd was gathering, rapidly, and then at noon a huge crowd came in from the east, from Muscatine County. They said that half of the west part of Muscatine County was on that special train. So there was a large crowd, and there were things downtown to entertain the people to start with, and the band played on each corner, and the crowd would gather, and then they'd move to the next corner, and then of course the idea was that some of the people would go into the stores and buy merchandise. Then they had some foot races for the young men of the city, and I remember George Reichart, who was a relative of the famous Bill Reichart, Iowa football player, won the 100-yard dash, and he got $2 for winning it. And then they had a big automobile parade, and well, we're having an aviation meet here today, and we're getting a little opposition from another plane. But there are planes all around. It's rather logical that we should have this story about the first flight when there are so many planes in Iowa City. But anyhow, that first day, about noon, they had an automobile parade, and there were 100 cars in it, and they were decorated with bunting and flowers. And of course, in those days, an automobile parade back in 1910 was really something, and people turned out to see that. Well, all this activity went on in the forenoon, and then finally the crowd went to the fairgrounds. And as I told you, that first flight was very, very successful. The previous day, Captain Baldwin also had staged a flight out there. That was not so successful. He took off, but he ran into some wind currents, and he had to land in a cornfield. So the crowd was a little disappointed, and they gave them wind checks. They charged 50 cents to get in, and I remember my folks paid 50 cents, and we sat in the grandstand and had an excellent seat to see all the activity. Well, after the first flight, they waited about an hour for the second flight. And by that time, the crowd was getting really excited, but the wind had changed, and they were not able to take off to the northeast. They had to take off a little bit to the southeast. And when they went to the southeast, they had to go up. There was a grade there, and there were some trees, and that presented some problems. So Captain Baldwin was a little bit apprehensive about it, but of course he had agreed to fly both days. He got $1,000 for each day, and so he was all ready to start off to the southeast. And I might add that Captain Baldwin really didn't look very much like an aviator. He was 57 years old at the time. He weighed 240 pounds, but he was a veteran of flying. He'd been in 3,000 balloon ascension, dirigible balloon ascensions, and plane flights. He owned his own plane, and he was quite a veteran. So while he didn't look the part of an aviator, he had the experience, and that's what it took. So he started out on that second flight, and he was going a little bit to the southeast, and there was some apprehension about whether he could clear the trees. And I remember seeing that. I was sitting right in the grandstand. I can see it as if it were today. He started, and it looked like he wasn't going to clear those trees, but he twisted the wings like this. I can still see them going to the left, trying to squeeze between those trees, but he was not able to, and the plane caught the bottom, the wheels caught the bottom or the top of the trees, and he crashed down to the earth. Fortunately, he was not seriously injured, but the plane was a complete wreck. The next day, Captain Baldwin was up and around, and he'd already ordered another plane to be built, and it was that, well, we have more opposition from another plane here. Well, that's logical. After all, we're talking about airplane flights, and we're talking about that first one in Iowa City. Well, anyhow, the next day, Captain Baldwin was around town, and the chamber, or the commercial club, agreed that he should be paid the $2,000 because he had wrecked his plane, and while he didn't give a very good flight the first day, the second day was excellent, and it was very exciting with this plane crash that he had. So that was the story of the first airplane flight in Iowa City, and it certainly was an exciting day, and it's just interesting how from that early day to what we have here today with an airplane flight, that so much has been accomplished with planes. I'm now standing in front of a monoplane. The plane that I was standing in front of before was a biplane, which was somewhat similar to the plane that Captain Baldwin flew in. However, the one I was standing in front of was a much more substantial plane than Captain Baldwin's. As I mentioned in my article in the Iowa City Press-Citizen, when I wrote about that first airplane flight in Iowa City, Captain Baldwin's plane was a very flimsy-looking plane compared to what we have today. It had bicycle wheels on it. Really, they were bicycle wheels. And it almost looked like it was held together by wire and glue. But it was the aviation type of plane of the day. Captain Baldwin complained a bit about the facilities out at the fairgrounds because the infield was not very long. He said that he needed 500 or 600 feet, which is around 200 yards, to get off the ground. Well, of course, today the planes are much heavier and much larger, and it takes more distance. Captain Baldwin figured that he had to be going about 40 miles an hour before he took off from the ground. And his plane was going about 40 miles an hour when he was in the air. So it's surprising the increase that we have in speed today compared to what we used to have. Well, you know, man has always been obsessed with the idea of flying. He always wanted to fly like the birds because he thought that was an easier way to get around, and of course it was a more exciting way if a man was able to fly. And there were all kinds of planes that came on the market in the early years. Well, I shouldn't say on the market. There were all kinds of planes that were developed or tried to be developed. Some of the earliest ones even had the wings flapping like a bird, but of course they never made a success. Wilbur and Orville Wright were the two men who developed the first plane that was able to take off with a motor. They started back in 1899 experimenting. They were not engineers either. Actually, Wilbur and Orville were high school dropouts, and they were running a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. And they were obsessed with the idea of trying to fly. And they did a great deal of experimenting right there in connection with their bicycle shop. They had a wind tunnel, and they would experiment with the effect of wind on the different types of planes they had in mind. They used to get into terrible arguments between them. In fact, the man that worked for them said he never heard an argument as bad as one they got into. And then about 15 minutes after they quit arguing, they got together, and Orville said, "Well, Wilbur, I agree, you were right, I was wrong." And then Wilbur said, No, Orville, you were right, I was wrong." And then they took the opposite sides and they got into another argument. But anyhow, their arguments seemed to pay off because in the end, in 1903, December 17th, they were down at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. And they went there because the sand dunes there was lots of wind, no trees, and they made a monorail. They didn't have wheels on their plane, but they made this monorail, and they got all set. They got the motor running, and Orville got in the plane. Orville was the younger of the two. He was 32. Wilbur was four years older. Well, you know, we're here today at the second Iowa City Air get-together, and that's what the racket is in the background. Well, anyhow, Wilbur and Orville got this plane on the monorail, and Orville was in it, and Wilbur ran along the outside steadying the wing. And on that first attempt, they went 120, or Orville went 120 feet in his plane. He was aloft for 12 seconds. Well, they were encouraged, and so they made 4 other attempts that day, the longest of which was 852 feet, which would be about 300 yards, and Orville was aloft 59 seconds. So there were lots of experiments in those early years with people trying one thing and another. In fact, I even did a little experimenting in aerodynamics. I'd been out to the fairgrounds, I believe it was in 1908. That was about 2 years earlier, and there was a balloon ascension, and I saw the balloon go up, and when it got to a certain height, why then the balloonist would cut loose with his parachute and float gently to the ground. Well, I thought that looked wonderful, and so I decided I would try the same idea, and I would get up in the haymow of our barn and jump from the haymow with an umbrella. Well, it sounded like a great idea, but I assure you it didn't work, because I jumped, and I jumped stiff-legged. I didn't jump with a little bend in my knees, and I saw stars for about a half an hour because the jolt was so severe. So I decided that I was not cut out to be an airplane operator, and so that was the end of my experimenting with aerodynamics. But along in 1910, which was 7 years after the Wright brothers made their first flight, a man by the name of Eugene Ely made the first landing on a ship. In other words, an airplane carrier. And this was Ely landed on the SS Birmingham off the coast of North Carolina or South Carolina. I guess it was South Carolina. And he landed on the ship, and he was able to take off from the ship. So that was the first landing on an air carrier. That was November 14th, 1910. That was the same year that Captain Baldwin flew in Iowa City. Ely was killed the next year in Georgia while he was doing some stunt flying. One thing about Ely that is interesting locally, he actually came from this community. He lived west of Iowa City, about 18 miles, just over the border into Iowa County, a little bit closer to Williamsburg than to Iowa City. There was a priest at the church in Cosgrove, which is about 10 miles west of Iowa City, who had a Pope Hartford automobile. That was one of the early automobiles, about 1906. And of course, in those days, it took some kind of a mechanical genius to fly these planes. And so there was no one in the parish at St. Peter's Catholic Church in Cosgrove who could handle an automobile. So Father Smith got Eugene Ely to be his chauffeur. And so Ely was well known in this area, driving this Pope Hartford automobile. Well, anyhow, Ely became quite mechanical, and he got interested in planes. And so he started flying planes. And he flew all around this area doing barnstorming, taking people up in planes, flying stunts and so forth. And one time the Harrington family were having a reunion. That was just this side of Williamsburg. They used to have those wonderful orchards out there. And Eugene Ely came back for the reunion. So he flew his plane in, and he buzzed the family in their reunion, and then he landed in the field just adjacent, just narrowly missing a tree. But Eugene Ely always liked to live dangerously. He was not related to me, but he was a cousin of my cousin, Dr. Leslie Weber Jr., who was connected with the College of Medicine here. Well, anyhow, experimenting was quite the thing in those days, and so there were more and more people that were doing that type of thing. They were flying stunts at fairs. They were taking people up in planes, but there was no practical use for planes. They were just for exhibition. And so the early years of the plane had no practical purpose. Well, now we'll go on and talk a little bit about a practical use. The first really practical use that airplanes were put to occurred in 1920, and Iowa City was right in the center of it. That's when, when airmail service was instituted. That was back in 1920. Actually, it was December 8th. There was a group of Iowa City businessmen, small group who saw the future of airmail service, gathered down here. It was a cold day, and they were waiting for the first flight to come in. They built a bonfire, and they waited, and they waited, and they got colder, and they got colder. And just as they were about thinking that they ought to just quench out the embers and go home, they heard the drone of a plane from the east, and here came the first airmail flight into Iowa City. And the first airmail service was from Chicago to Omaha. Iowa City was about halfway, and actually the straight line between Chicago and Omaha is 1 mile to the south of where we're standing today. Well, anyhow, this small group of Iowa City businessmen were standing there waiting for the first flight. And the plane came in. Howard Smith, who is an old-time favorite in Iowa City, who'd flown many flights into the city, got out of the plane, and he stood around the fire and warmed up, had a little lunch, set off the first mail for Iowa City, and after half an hour, then he took off for the west, for Omaha. And of course, this flight, this route through Iowa City was a good one because they followed the Rock Island Railroad. It was easy to see, and they made the trip in pretty good time. There was that same day there was supposed to be an eastbound flight from Omaha to Chicago, but they were forced down about Monroe, Iowa, near Des Moines. So the first flight from Omaha to Chicago was the next day, and it was Howard K. Smith who flew that flight. Incidentally, this airport was supposed to have been named, or was named, after Howard K. Smith. I don't know just when it lost its name, but anyhow, it's now known as the Iowa City Airport. Well, anyhow, Howard K. Smith got out of the plane, and the only mail that they had to go to Chicago was a 10-pound pig. Robert N. Carson, an Iowa City businessman, was sending a pig in to Manager Burke of the Congress Hotel in Chicago. And so the first airmail to go out of Iowa City, which might be rather logical, was a 10-pound pig. And they say that a few days after the pig arrived, he served a very good purpose because Captain Eddie Rickenbacker was there for some kind of a banquet, and the 10-pound pig was served at that time. Well, this was daylight airmail service, and it was quite successful. I believe Charles Lindbergh even flew some of the flights through Iowa City. Well, then, 4.5 years later, the first daylight night airmail service was instituted. And that first flight into Iowa City was July 1st, 1924. And that was a big event. By that time, the flight from New York City to San Francisco was lighted. They called it the Great White Way. There were giant lights that sent a beam out 40, 50 miles. Stationed here in Iowa City, there was one east of here, there was one west. And so the planes had, had a good way of finding their route at night. And so the first flight was to land here, and did land here at 8:30 p.m., July 1st, and there was a tremendous crowd here for that first flight. After all, this was an historic event. There were 3,500 people crowded in here. It was a terrible traffic jam. They anticipated that it would be, and Captain Bill Hike and his cavalry unit and Sheriff Martin had his force down here, and they were able to keep the highway open. And the plane came in and departed. That first plane had a letter from President Coolidge to the Governor Richardson of California. And then that flight took 32 hours and 5 minutes to get from New York to San Francisco. And then the flight going east took 34 hours and 45 minutes. several hours longer going the opposite direction. I don't know just why that was. But anyhow, that was the start of transcontinental airmail service. And Iowa City was right in the center of it. The segment from Chicago to Cheyenne was 850 miles. There were 3 stops for fueling and service. The first one was at Iowa City, the second at Omaha, and the third at North Platte, Nebraska. So Iowa City played a very integral part in that first airmail service. At that time, this was not really known as the Iowa City Airport. It was just Benjamin's pasture, and this is what was used. So it was a very important event. It was a great use. It was put, the airplane was put to, and Iowa City was in the center of it. So it was nice to be able to tell you about that story. No story about the Iowa City Airport is complete without telling something about Paul Shaw, who was a factor in the Iowa City Airport for 3 to 4 generations, or decades, I believe. Shaw learned to fly in Cedar Rapids with an aerial circus. That was back in the days when a man would get out on the wing and stand up, holding on to a post that was on the top of the plane, or he would climb down a rope ladder below the plane, and the plane would fly over the crowd. Sometimes they had a girl who would climb up on top of the plane. So it was very exciting, and that was the type of flying that was done in those early years. I asked Paul one day if he'd ever had any close calls, and he said yes, he'd had 3. He'd had many forced landings, but only 3 that were serious. The first one was the most serious, and that was in Cedar Rapids in 1924 when he had a crash landing on the southwest side of Cedar Rapids. He had a passenger with him, but fortunately neither of them were seriously injured. The plane was demolished. Then he had another crash over by Olin, which was quite serious and did a great deal of damage to the plane. And then the third crash landing that he had was right over here in the Haldane oats field. Shaw had taken off to the north, and the plane had not gained very much altitude when it conked out. And Shaw was able to get it turned around, but he couldn't get it landed in the airport, and he landed in the oats field without any serious damage to himself, but it didn't do any good to the oats. Well, anyhow, Shaw became manager of the Iowa City Airport in 1928, and he was very closely associated with all aviation activities in Iowa City the rest of the years that he was in flying. He taught, during World War II, he taught 5,000 men and some women to fly. They had a certain course that they took, and Shaw gave them their diploma when they had become sufficiently proficient. Then I asked Shaw how many hours he had piloted planes, and he said that he had logged 14,000 hours in his own planes, and he had logged a number of other hours in other planes. I asked him how many times he thought he had landed and taken off, and I said, well, give me a ball. He didn't know for sure, of course. He gave me and I asked him for a ballpark figure. Well, he said, I think it would be well over 100,000 times that I took off and landed. So he certainly had an interesting, long career, and without any major difficulties in all those years. Well, you know, as I've been thinking about this first flight in Iowa City back October 13th, 1910, when I was a wide-eyed, almost 10-year-old boy. Planes were very flimsy. You weren't sure whether they were going to fly, and if they did fly, they weren't sure whether they might not crash. So it strikes me as rather unusual that 50 years later, my wife and I, Martha and I, flew around the world. And of course, you always have a catalyst that starts you on those trips. And so we had a granddaughter who was born in Japan with the name Michiko, incidentally, and we wanted to see Michiko while she was in Japan, where she was born. So we flew over there, and then we thought, well, we're halfway around the world, or almost halfway. Why don't we go all the way around the world? So in 1959, we made the trip around the world, not in a flimsy plane that was held together with wire, but in a luxury plane where they served us fine meals and they served cocktails, and it was a very pleasant flight. From Japan, we went on through Hong Kong, Bangkok, all the way across Asia in one night, landing only in Burma and in Pakistan, and then ending, of all places, in Beirut, where we went to church on Easter. And then we came on home the rest of the way through Rome, Paris, London, and to Iowa City. So all of that happened in the 50 years from the time that I saw that first flight in Iowa City. So it is remarkable what all has happened in 50 years. Well, it's been interesting telling you the story about flying in Iowa City. Thank you.